In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a celebrated author, Cedric Hawthorne, collapses mid-book signing, poisoned by a fatal sip of cyanide-laced water. As whispers of scandal and betrayal swirl, Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of motives, ambition, obsession, fear, and a critic's deadly vendetta. Was it the publisher's greed, a fan's broken heart, an assistant's hidden grudge, or a rival's dark secret? In just 30 seconds, step into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where every glance hides a clue, and the truth lies in the smallest details. Chapter 1. The Arrival at St. Mary's Bookshop. The autumn sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the high street, their leaves a tapestry of amber and crimson. Miss Jane Marple, clad in her familiar tweed skirt and lavender cardigan, stepped lightly along the cobblestones, her black lace-up shoes tapping a measured rhythm. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, missed nothing. Not the butcher's boy whistling as he swept the pavement, nor the flutter of curtains in Mrs. Pye's cottage as the village gossip took note of the day's visitors. Miss Marple was bound for St. Mary's Bookshop, where a rare event had stirred the sleepy village into a hum of anticipation. A book signing by Cedric Hawthorne, author of the scandalous novel The Bitter Truth. The bookshop, a narrow building with ivy-clad walls and a creaking sign, was usually a sanctuary for quiet browsers, its shelves heavy with dusty volumes and the faint scent of aged paper. Today, however, it bustled with an unaccustomed crowd. Villagers mingled with strangers from neighboring towns, their voices a low buzz of excitement. Miss Marple had been persuaded to attend by her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who, with her penchant for drama, insisted that Cedric's book was the talk of the county, positively wicked. Miss Marple, ever curious about human nature, had agreed, her knitting bag tucked under her arm as a pretext for her presence. She settled into a cushioned chair near the back, beside a display of gardening manuals, her needles clicking softly as she surveyed the room. At the front, behind a polished oak table draped in green baize, sat Cedric Hawthorne himself. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with a mane of silver-flecked hair and a theatrical air that suggested he enjoyed his fame. His dark suit was immaculate, though his tie was slightly askew, and his smile, as he greeted each fan, held a practiced charm that did not quite reach his eyes. Those eyes, Miss Marple noted, darted restlessly, as if seeking something or someone in the crowd. A glass of water and a fountain pen lay before him, alongside a stack of his novels, their bold red covers emblazoned with the title that had set tongues wagging. Among the throng, Miss Marple's gaze settled on 4 figures who stood out like characters in a play. First was Margaret Voss, Cedric's publisher, a woman of stern countenance whose tailored gray suit and severe bun suggested a no-nonsense disposition. She stood near the table, her sharp voice cutting through the chatter as she directed the flow of the line with the precision of a general. Next was Clara Henshaw, a young woman with a flushed face and eager eyes, clutching a dog-eared copy of The Bitter Truth as if it were a sacred relic. Her devotion was palpable, her hands trembling as she awaited her turn. Then there was Timothy Lyle, Cedric's assistant, a lanky young man with a nervous tic, his fingers fumbling as he arranged pens and replenished the water jug. Finally, leaning against a bookshelf with a sardonic air, was Roland Pierce, a literary critic whose venomous reviews of Cedric's work were as well known as the novels themselves. His notebook and pen were poised, ready to dissect the event with his usual disdain. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the undercurrents in the room. Cedric's book, she knew from Mrs. Bantry's breathless account, had stirred controversy by exposing secrets of the gentry, affairs, frauds, and whispered scandals that had made enemies in high places. The villagers, too, had their opinions, some admiring Cedric's boldness, others clucking disapproval at his audacity. Miss Marple, who had seen many a village drama unfold, sensed that the tensions here were not merely literary. There was a brittleness in Cedric's smile, a watchfulness in Margaret's stance, a fever in Clara's gaze, and a cold calculation in Roland's smirk. Timothy's agitation, too, hinted at more than mere overwork. As the line of fans shuffled forward, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a visiting lecturer had caused a stir with his radical ideas, only to find himself at the mercy of hidden grudges. People, she knew, could be stirred to dangerous passions by words, especially words that cut too close to truth. Her eyes flicked to the water jug on Cedric's table, its contents glinting in the light. A small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had learned never to dismiss the small things. For now, she watched and waited, her gentle smile masking the keen mind that was already threading together the strands of a mystery, yet to unfold. Chapter 2. The Fatal Sip. The interior of St. Mary's bookshop, bathed in the soft glow of autumn light filtering through its leaded windows, hummed with the subdued excitement of the gathered crowd. The air carried the mingled scents of polished wood, old books, and the crisp perfume of new pages from the stacks of Cedric Hawthorne's The Bitter Truth. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively at the back beside a shelf of gardening manuals, her knitting needles moving with their habitual rhythm, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of detachment and acuity. Her lavender cardigan and neat tweed skirt blended into the background, rendering her almost invisible to the bustling throng, yet her sharp eyes missed nothing. The signing event, now in full swing, had drawn an eclectic mix of villagers and outsiders, their murmurs rising and falling like a tide as they queued to meet the celebrated and controversial author. Cedric Hawthorne sat at the oak table, its green baize surface cluttered with copies of his book, a glass of water, and a gleaming fountain pen. His silver-flecked hair caught the light as he leaned forward to sign a copy, his smile a practiced mask that did little to conceal the faint tension in his jaw. Miss Marple noted the way. His fingers tightened briefly around the pen when a particularly eager fan lingered too long, and how his gaze flickered toward the edges of the room as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. The crowd, a mix of St. Mary Mead's curious residents and strangers from farther afield, pressed closer, their voices a low buzz of admiration, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed disapproval. Cedric's novel, with its unsparing depiction of high society's secrets, had stirred passions, and the atmosphere in the bookshop held an edge of anticipation, as if the very air awaited a spark. Among the figures circling Cedric's orbit, Miss Marple's attention lingered on the four who stood out most vividly. Margaret Voss, the publisher, moved with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to command. Her gray suit, tailored to a fault, and her tightly pinned bun gave her an air of unyielding authority. Yet Miss Marple caught the fleeting tremor in her hands as she adjusted a stack of books, a sign of nerves beneath the polished exterior. Clara Henshaw, the ardent fan, stood near the front of the line, her face flushed with a fervor that bordered on worship. Her fingers clutched a worn copy of The Bitter Truth, its pages marked with countless readings, and her eyes shone with an intensity that made Miss Marple think of a village girl who had once fallen too deeply for a charismatic preacher. Timothy Lyle, Cedric's assistant, hovered at the table's edge, his lanky frame bent as he fussed with the water jug and pens. His movements were jerky, his eyes darting nervously, and Miss Marple wondered what burden lay behind his anxious demeanor. Finally, Roland Pierce, the critic, lounged against a bookshelf, his lean face set in a sneer as he scribbled in a notebook. His presence was a discordant note, his disdain for Cedric palpable in the curl of his lip. The line of fans moved steadily, each presenting their book for Cedric's signature. Clara, now at the front, stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mr. Hawthorne, your book, it's changed my life. The way you see the truth, it's like you're speaking to me." Cedric's smile softened, though his eyes remained wary. "I'm glad it resonated, Miss Henshaw," she supplied, her cheeks reddening. She handed him her book, and he scrawled a dedication with a flourish, passing it back with a nod. Clara clutched the book to her chest, retreating with a look of rapture that made Miss Marple's needles pause. Such devotion, she knew, could be a dangerous thing, capable of twisting into something darker if unmet or betrayed. Cedric reached for his glass of water, the crystal catching the light as he raised it to his lips. Miss Marple, her gaze never straying, noted that Timothy had refilled it moments before from a sealed bottle, his hands shaking slightly as he poured. Margaret, standing nearby, leaned in to whisper something to Cedric, her voice sharp and urgent, though the words were lost in the crowd's murmur. Roland, still at his post by the bookshelf, glanced up from his notebook, his eyes narrowing as Cedric took a sip. The author set the glass down, his expression unchanged, and resumed signing. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of St. Mary Mead, prickled with unease. There was something in the air, a tension, a wrongness, that she could not yet name. The signing continued for another 10 minutes, the queue dwindling as villagers and visitors alike secured their signed copies. Cedric's charm held, though Miss Marple noticed a faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, unusual for the cool October day. He reached for the glass again, taking a longer draught this time, and as he set it down, his hand faltered. A cough broke from his throat, sharp and sudden, drawing eyes from the crowd. He coughed again, more violently, his face flushing a sickly red. The book in his hand slipped to the table, and he clutched at his collar, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Water," he croaked, but as Timothy lunged to retrieve the glass, Cedric's body convulsed. His chair tipped backward, and he collapsed to the floor, the glass tumbling after him, shattering on the polished wood with a sound like a gunshot. The room erupted in chaos. Gasps and cries filled the air as the crowd surged forward, only to be pushed back by Margaret's commanding shout to "Give him space." Clara let out a wail, her book falling forgotten to the floor, while Timothy stood frozen, his face ashen. Roland alone remained still, his notebook lowered, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, rising swiftly despite her age, slipped her knitting into her bag and moved closer, her small frame weaving through the panicked throng. Dr. Haydock, a familiar figure from St. Mary Mead, was already at Cedric's side, his fingers probing for a pulse. The doctor's face, usually genial, grew grim as he shook his head. "He's gone," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the din. "Dead." A hush fell, broken only by Clara's stifled sobs and the rustle of uneasy movement. Miss Marple knelt beside the shattered glass, her handkerchief pressed to her nose as she inhaled cautiously. Amid the scent of spilled water, there was something else, a faint, bitter tang, like crushed almonds, unmistakable to one who had once encountered it in a long-ago case involving a spurned suitor and a poisoned cordial. Cyanide, she thought, her mind racing. She straightened, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the frozen tableau of suspects. Margaret's hands were clenched, her lips a tight line. Clara's grief seemed genuine, yet her intensity unnerved. Timothy's pallor suggested shock, but his eyes darted toward the door as if seeking escape. Roland's calm was too perfect, his detachment a mask that Miss Marple longed to pierce. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his brisk efficiency a balm to the rattled crowd. The bookshop was cordoned off, its windows now shadowed as the afternoon light faded. Officers herded the attendees outside, taking names and statements, while Dr. Haydock conferred with Craddock near Cedric's body. Miss Marple, lingering near the table, caught fragments of their conversation. Cyanide suspected, the glass to be tested, no obvious source yet identified. She glanced at the water jug, still half full, and the broken shards of the glass, now being carefully collected by a constable. Her mind turned over the sequence of events. Timothy pouring the water, Cedric drinking, the sudden collapse. The poison, she reasoned, must have been introduced moments before, but by whom and how? Craddock approached her, his expression a mix of respect and wry amusement. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. Any thoughts?" His tone was light, but his eyes were keen, knowing her penchant for unraveling mysteries. "Only that it's a sad business, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "But I did notice the water. Timothy poured it, but the jug was left unattended for a moment when he fetched more books. And that smell, it put me in mind of a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "Cyanide, you think? We'll have the lab confirm it. Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated, her gaze drifting to the 4 suspects now gathered near the door, each under the watchful eye of a constable. "People are so often what they seem, Inspector, and yet not. I should like to know more about Mr. Pierce's dislike of Mr. Hawthorne's work, and perhaps why Miss Henshaw was so very devoted. And Mr. Lyle? He seems terribly nervous for a mere assistant." Craddock's lips twitched, but he made no comment, accustomed to her cryptic insights. "We'll question them all," he assured her, moving off to oversee the scene. As the crowd dispersed and the bookshop grew quiet, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes tracing the path from the table to the back door, barely visible behind a curtained alcove. She recalled a village fete where a thief had slipped poison into a judge's tea during a moment of distraction, the act unseen by all but a child who noticed a stranger's hand. Here, too, someone had acted, swiftly, unseen. Margaret with her access to Cedric's table, Clara so close in her fervor, Timothy handling the water, or Roland, whose cold eyes suggested a man capable of more than words. Miss Marple's needles, now stilled in her bag, would resume their work later, but for now, her mind was knitting together the threads of a puzzle that had only just begun to unravel. The fatal sip had been taken, and with it, the quiet of Saint. Mary Mead had been shattered, leaving a mystery that demanded her gentle, relentless scrutiny. Chapter 3. The Scene. Examined. The late afternoon light had faded to a muted gray as St. Mary's bookshop, now a somber stage for tragedy, stood cordoned off by the brisk efficiency of Inspector Craddock's men. The crowd had been ushered outside, their murmurs of shock and curiosity muffled by the heavy oak door, leaving an eerie quiet within. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked neatly at her side, lingered near the green baize table where Cedric Hawthorne had met his end. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, roamed the scene with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to finding truth in the smallest details. The bookshop, with its familiar scent of old paper and polished wood, now carried a new note, the acrid tang of fear and suspicion that clung to the air like damp mist. Inspector Craddock, his notebook in hand, directed his constables with a calm authority that belied the gravity of the moment. The shattered remnants of Cedric's water glass had been carefully gathered into a sealed bag, destined for the police laboratory, while the water jug, still half full, stood untouched on the table, its contents glinting under the bookshop's dim lamps. Dr. Haydock, having completed his initial examination, conferred with Craddock near the body, which lay covered by a sheet, a stark outline against the polished floor. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, caught fragments of their low voices, cyanide confirmed by the telltale almond-like scent, death likely instantaneous, no signs of struggle beyond the final convulsions. Her mind, ever alert, filed away these details, recalling a case in St. Mary Mead where a gardener's misuse of cyanide had led to a grim accident, its odor unmistakable, even to her untrained nose. The four key figures, Margaret Voss, Clara Henshaw, Timothy Lyle, and Roland Pierce, stood apart, each under the watchful eye of a constable near the bookshop's entrance. Margaret, her stern face pale but composed, adjusted her suit jacket with a precision that suggested control, though Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers as she smoothed her skirt. Clara, still clutching her signed copy of The Bitter Truth, wept silently, her eyes red-rimmed but fixed on the covered form of Cedric, as if willing him to rise. Timothy, his lanky frame hunched, shifted from foot to foot, his gaze darting toward the back door, a curtained alcove that Miss Marple had already marked as a point of interest. Roland, by contrast, stood with an almost insolent calm, his notebook now tucked into his pocket, his lean face betraying no emotion save a faint curl of disdain at the corner of his mouth. Craddock approached Miss Marple, his expression a blend of professional courtesy and genuine curiosity. "You've a knack for being in the right place, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "Anything strike you about this business?" She tilted her head, her smile gentle, but her eyes keen. "Only that it's a dreadful thing, Inspector. A man in his prime, cut down so suddenly. That water jug, though, it was unattended for a moment, wasn't it? When young Mr. Lyle stepped away to fetch more books." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "You noticed that, too. We're testing the jug and the glass fragments. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock thinks, but we'll need the lab to confirm the source. Anything else?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the suspects, her voice soft but deliberate. People are so quick to act on their passions, Inspector. I wonder who might have felt strongly enough about Mr. Hawthorne's work or his person to do such a thing. The critic, Mr. Pierce, seems to have taken a particular dislike to him. And Miss Henshaw's devotion. It's rather intense, don't you think? Craddock's lips twitched, accustomed to her habit of seeing what others missed. "We'll question them all," he said. "Let's see what they have to say for themselves." He began with Margaret Voss, calling her to a corner of the shop where a small table had been cleared for interviews. Margaret sat ramrod straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I was managing the event," she said, her voice clipped. "Cedric was our star author. His book saved my publishing house from ruin. Why would I harm him?" Yet Miss Marple, standing just within earshot, noted the slight catch in her voice when she mentioned the book's success, as if it carried a weight she did not name. Margaret claimed she'd been too busy directing the crowd to notice anything amiss, but her eyes flicked briefly to the water jug, and Miss Marple wondered if she knew more than she let on. Next was Clara Henshaw, who approached Craddock with the hesitancy of a frightened deer. Her tears had dried, but her hands trembled as she clutched her book. "I only wanted his signature," she said, her voice breaking. He was everything to me. His words, they made me feel seen." When Craddock pressed her about the moments before Cedric's collapse, she shook her head, insisting she'd been focused only on him, not the table or the water. Miss Marple, watching from her vantage point, recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead who had once idolized a poet, only to turn bitter when her devotion went unreturned. Clara's fervor, she thought, might hide a deeper wound. Timothy Lyle was next, his nervous energy palpable as he sat across from Craddock. His fingers twisted a loose thread on his cuff, and his eyes avoided the inspector's. "I poured the water from a sealed bottle," he said, his voice high and strained. "I swear it. I set it on the table, then went to get more books from the back. I wasn't gone long, maybe a minute." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "A minute's long enough for someone to tamper with it, Mr. Lyle." Timothy flushed, stammering. "I didn't see anything. I was just doing my job." Miss Marple, her knitting needles still in her bag, noted a faint stain on Timothy's sleeve. Dark, not quite ink, but something that merited closer scrutiny. She thought of a nervous boy in her village who had once hidden a theft behind a flurry of excuses and wondered what Timothy might be concealing. Finally, Roland Pierce sauntered to the table, his air of detachment almost theatrical. "Cedric's death is no great loss to literature," he said coolly, ignoring Craddock's frown. His work was sensationalist, stirring up trouble for its own sake. Poetic justice, perhaps, that it ended this way. When pressed about his actions during the signing, Roland shrugged. "I was watching, taking notes. I didn't go near his table." Yet Miss Marple, her memory as sharp as her needles, recalled his position by the bookshelf, close enough to the alcove leading to the back door. His calm, she thought, was too studied, like a man in Saint. Mary Mead, who had once masked his guilt with bravado. As Craddock concluded the initial interviews, Miss Marple stepped closer to the table, her small frame unnoticed by the bustling constables. She bent to examine the floor where the glass had shattered, her handkerchief again pressed to her nose. The almond-like scent lingered faintly, strongest near the shards, suggesting the poison had been in the glass itself, not the jug. She straightened, her mind turning over the timing. Timothy's brief absence, the crowd's press, the moment when all eyes were on Cedric's flourish of the pen. Someone had acted with precision, unseen by the distracted throng. But who? Craddock rejoined her, his notebook now filled with scribbled observations. "The lab will tell us more," he said, "but I'd wager the cyanide was slipped into the glass during that minute Lyle was gone. The question is, who had the chance?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. "And the motive, Inspector. People do such things for love, or money, or hate. Mr. Hawthorne's book stirred all three, I think." Craddock gave her a sidelong glance, half amused, half respectful. "You'll have me chasing shadows, Miss Marple, but I'll keep an eye on those four." As the bookshop was sealed for the night, its windows dark and its shelves silent, Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening air. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet under the gathering dusk, but her mind was far from restful. She thought of the four suspects, each with their own secrets, their own reasons to wish Cedric silenced, or not. Margaret's ambition, Clara's obsession, Timothy's fear, Roland's scorn. They were threads in a tapestry she had yet to fully unravel. As she walked home, her steps slow and deliberate, she recalled a long-ago incident at a village fair where a poisoned cake had been slipped onto a table during a moment of chaos. The answer had lain in the smallest detail, a crumb overlooked, a glance misplaced. Here, too, she sensed, the truth would be found in what others failed to see. With her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, Miss Marple resolved to watch and listen and wait. Chapter 4. The Publisher's Ambition. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the chimneys and softening the outlines of the cottages along the high street. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the October chill, sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room at Gossington Hall, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The room, with its chintz curtains and well-worn armchairs, was a haven of comfort, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the cozy setting. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, turned over the events of the previous day at St. Mary's bookshop, where Cedric Hawthorne's life had been snuffed out by a fatal sip. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for intrigue, leaned forward in her chair, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Jane, you must tell me everything. Poison, in our own village. It's like something out of one of Cedric's novels." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her gaze distant. "It's a sad business, Dolly. A man like Mr. Hawthorne, stirring up such passions with his words. It's no wonder someone wished him silent. But who, and why? That's the question." Mrs. Bantry, never one for restraint, launched into a torrent of village gossip, her voice rising with each tidbit. They say Margaret Voss, his publisher, was at her wits' end with him. That book of his, The Bitter Truth, pulled her company out of ruin. But I heard she and Cedric quarreled bitterly over money, and his next book, oh, Jane, it's said to be even more scandalous. What if she thought he'd ruin her with it? Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her bag, began their gentle clicking, a counterpoint to her friend's fervor. She recalled Margaret Voss at the bookshop, her tailored suit and severe manner masking a faint tremor of nerves. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could drive people to desperate acts, as she had seen in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a shopkeeper, fearing ruin, had tampered with a rival's accounts. Margaret's publishing house, Voss and Sons, had been teetering on bankruptcy before Cedric's book became a sensation. Could she have seen him as both savior and threat? "I think, Dolly," Miss Marple said softly, "I should like to have a word with Miss Voss. There's often more to ambition than meets the eye." Leaving Gossington Hall, Miss Marple made her way to the King's Arms, the village inn where Margaret had taken a room. The inn, a half-timbered building with a sagging roof, was quiet at this hour, its tap room empty save for a barmaid polishing glasses. Margaret was in the small parlor, surrounded by papers and ledgers, her face drawn as she scribbled notes. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her expression shifting from surprise to guarded courtesy. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I'm rather busy, but please, sit." Her voice was crisp, but Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around her eyes, the way her hand tightened on her pen. "I shan't keep you long," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her knitting. "I only wish to offer my condolences about Mr. Hawthorne. His loss must be a great blow to your publishing house." Margaret's lips thinned. "It is. Cedric was difficult, but his book was a triumph. It saved Voss and Sons from collapse. We'd have been bankrupt without it." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or fear, beneath the words. "And his next book?" she asked gently. "I hear it was to be even bolder." Margaret's hand stilled, her pen hovering over a ledger. "It was unfinished," she said curtly. "But yes, he claimed it would name names, people who'd rather stay hidden. I told him it was risky, but Cedric never listened." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her eyes on her work, but her mind alert. She recalled a village woman who had once invested all her hopes in a single venture, only to turn ruthless when it threatened to fail. "It must have been trying," she said, "to balance such a talent with such recklessness." Margaret's gaze sharpened, as if sensing a trap, but she nodded. "He was impossible at times, demanding higher royalties, refusing edits. But I had no reason to harm him. His success was mine." Yet as she spoke, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to a small vial on the desk, half hidden among the papers. It was labeled headache powder, its white contents innocuous at a glance, but the faint chemical whiff it exuded stirred a memory of that almond-like scent in the bookshop. "You've been under strain," Miss Marple said kindly, gesturing to the vial. "Those powders must be a comfort." Margaret's hand moved swiftly to cover the vial, her face tightening. "Just something to ease the headaches. This business, Cedric's death, the police, it's all been too much." Miss Marple nodded, her smile disarming, but her mind was racing. Cyanide, she knew, could be disguised in such powders, as she had learned from a case involving a chemist's apprentice in St. Mary Mead, who had once mislabeled a deadly compound. She made a mental note to mention the vial to Inspector Craddock, though she suspected Margaret would be too clever to leave such evidence in plain sight without reason. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused, her voice soft but probing. "Miss Voss, did you notice anyone near Mr. Hawthorne's table just before he took that fatal sip? Someone, perhaps, who seemed out of place?" Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she shook her head. "I was too busy managing the crowd. Timothy poured the water, but I didn't see anything unusual." Her words were firm, yet Miss Marple sensed a hesitation, as if she were weighing what to reveal. Thanking her, Miss Marple stepped back into the crisp air, her shawl drawn close. The village street was quiet, but her thoughts were anything but. She walked slowly toward the vicarage, her mind piecing together the threads of Margaret's story. The publisher's ambition was clear. Cedric's success had saved her firm, but his next book, with its promise of fresh scandals, could have endangered her reputation among the powerful figures he exposed. Had she seen him as a liability, a man whose recklessness threatened her hard-won stability? Miss Marple recalled a village merchant who had once sabotaged a partner's goods to protect his own interests, his calm demeanor hiding a ruthless streak. Margaret's composure, her quick deflection of questions, suggested a similar steel beneath her polished surface. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock taking tea with the vicar, his notebook open on the table. He greeted her with a nod, his expression expectant. "Miss Marple, I was just about to send for you. The lab's preliminary report confirms cyanide in the glass, but not the jug. It was added directly, likely during that moment Lyle was away." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resumed. "That's most interesting, Inspector. I've just come from Miss Voss. She's a woman of great ambition, and Mr. Hawthorne's books were both her salvation and her burden. There was a vial of headache powder on her desk, nothing unusual perhaps, but it had a faint smell that put me in mind of yesterday's tragedy." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "You think she might have—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile gentle. "I think nothing yet, Inspector. But ambition can make people do strange things, especially when their livelihood is at stake. I wonder, too, about her movements during the signing. She was near the table, wasn't she?" Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "Close enough to act, if she had the chance? We'll look into that vial. Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated, her needles pausing. Only that Miss Voss seemed anxious to distance herself from the water jug, yet she was quick to point out Mr. Lyle's role in pouring it. People often deflect, Inspector, when they fear scrutiny. Craddock's lips twitched, a sign he valued her insight, though he kept his tone professional. "We'll question her again, and the others, Miss Henshaw, Mr. Lyle, and that critic Pierce. They're all staying in the village for now." As Miss Marple left the vicarage, the mist was lifting, revealing the familiar contours of St. Mary Mead. She thought of Margaret Voss, her ambition a double-edged sword that could cut both ways, toward success or toward ruin. The vial, the tremor in her hands, the guarded answers. They were fragments of a puzzle, not yet complete. Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of human nature she knew so well. She would watch Margaret closely, but others, too, held secrets that demanded her attention. The truth, she sensed, lay hidden in the interplay of motives, and she would unravel it, stitch by careful stitch, as she always did. Chapter 5. The Fan's Devotion. The morning sun broke through the lingering mist, casting a soft glow over St. Mary Mead's High Street, where the cobblestones glistened with dew. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked with measured steps toward the village cafe, a modest establishment with lace curtains and a cheerful sign proclaiming tea and scones. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar companion, but her thoughts were far from the tranquil routine of village life. The death of Cedric Hawthorne at St. Mary's bookshop, a mere 2 days prior, had stirred the quiet community, and Miss Marple's mind was busy untangling the threads of motive and opportunity that wove through the tragedy. Today, her focus turned to Clara Henshaw, the young woman whose fervent devotion to Cedric had struck her as both touching and troubling. The cafe was abuzz with the low hum of village gossip, the clink of teacups mingling with whispers about the poisoning. Miss Marple settled at a corner table, her back to the wall, offering a clear view of the room. Clara, she had learned from Mrs. Bantry's inexhaustible well of local knowledge, often took her morning tea here, seeking solace in the familiar after the shock of Cedric's death. As if summoned by thought, Clara entered, her face pale and her eyes shadowed, the worn copy of The Bitter Truth still clutched in her hands. She wore a simple blue dress, its hem slightly frayed, and her hair, though neatly pinned, lacked its usual luster. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing parallels in human nature, thought of a village girl who had once pined for a traveling actor, her adoration blinding her to his flaws until rejection turned her heart bitter. "Good morning, Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she gestured to the empty chair opposite. Clara started, her eyes darting up, but she nodded and sat, her movements hesitant. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I didn't expect to see you here." Her voice was soft, tinged with the strain of recent grief. Miss Marple smiled, her needles emerging from her bag to begin their quiet rhythm. "I often come for a cup of tea when I'm thinking things over. Such a dreadful business at the bookshop. You were so fond of Mr. Hawthorne's work, I hear." Clara's face lit up, though her eyes remained haunted. "Oh, yes, his book. It's like he saw into my soul. He wrote about truth, about people hiding who they really are. It made me feel understood." Her fingers traced the cover of The Bitter Truth, its edges softened by countless readings. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. "It must have meant a great deal to meet him. I saw you at the signing, so eager for his signature. Did you know him well?" Clara's cheeks flushed and she looked down, her hands tightening on the book. "Not really. I wrote to him, sent letters through his publisher. He answered once, a letter promising we'd meet after the signing. But then—" Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. "He never came, and now he's gone." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but probing. A letter, she thought, recalling a case in St. Mary Mead where a forged note had led a young woman to ruin. "That must have been disappointing," she said. "Might I see the letter, dear? It sounds like something precious to you." Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty, but she nodded. "It's at home. I can show you later if you like." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile encouraging. "I'd be most grateful. A writer's words can mean so much, can't they? Sometimes, though, they stir feelings that run too deep." Clara's lips trembled, and she looked away, her fingers tracing the book's spine as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over Clara's words. Devotion, she knew, could twist into obsession, and obsession into something darker, as she had seen in a village spinster who had once tampered with a rival's gifts out of unrequited love. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, village life, the autumn fair, but Miss Marple's questions were deft, teasing out details of Clara's life. She was a seamstress, living alone in a small cottage on the edge of St. Mary Mead, her days filled with quiet work and her nights with Cedric's words. "I followed his tours," Clara admitted, her voice low. "London, Bath, even Bristol. I saved every penny to hear him speak. He was going to change things, you see. His next book, he said it would expose even more." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. "Did he tell you that himself?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "No, but I heard him talking to Miss Voss at a reading in London. He was so passionate. It made me believe in him even more." As Clara spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the dynamics of the signing. Clara had been close to Cedric's table, her fervor drawing eyes, but had she been close enough to slip something into his glass? The girl's grief seemed genuine, yet Miss Marple knew from experience that passion could mask guile. She recalled a young woman in her village who had poisoned a rival's tea, her tears convincing until a misplaced vial betrayed her. Clara's letter intrigued her most, a promise of a meeting that never happened. Was it genuine or a lure to stir her emotions? "You must miss him terribly," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "But people's hearts can be complicated, can't they? Sometimes they promise more than they mean to give." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought he saw me, really saw me, but maybe I was wrong." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but her mind racing. She thanked Clara and arranged to visit her cottage later to see the letter, then left the cafe, her steps slow as she navigated the high street. The village was stirring now, shopkeepers opening their doors, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Clara's devotion was a powerful force, but whether it had driven her to love or to vengeance remained unclear. At the police station, a small building with ivy creeping up its walls, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock reviewing reports. He greeted her with a wry smile. "Miss Marple, I'm beginning to think you're on this case, whether I ask you or not." She chuckled, settling into a chair. "I only wish to help, Inspector. I've been speaking with Miss Henshaw. She's a devoted fan, perhaps too devoted. She mentioned a letter from Mr. Hawthorne, promising a meeting that never happened. I wonder if it's genuine." Craddock raised an eyebrow, jotting a note. "You think it might be a forgery? To what end?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, retrieved from her bag. "People can be cruel, Inspector, even without meaning to. A letter like that could stir a young woman's hopes or break them. If someone else wrote it, perhaps to manipulate her, it might point to another hand in this affair." Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We'll look into it. The lab confirmed the cyanide was in the glass, not the jug, and it was a small dose, enough to kill quickly, but not so much as to be obvious until he drank. Whoever did it knew what they were about." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the village green lay quiet under the morning sun. "Miss Henshaw was near the table, Inspector, but so were others. Her devotion makes her a figure of interest, but I wonder if it made her a convenient distraction for someone else." Craddock leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're thinking someone used her as a decoy? That's clever, Miss Marple. We're checking alibis now. Miss Voss says she was busy with the crowd, Lyle was fetching books, and Pierce claims he never left his spot by the bookshelf." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the scene at the bookshop. Clara's intensity had drawn attention, but it was the quieter movements, the hand that slipped unnoticed, the moment of distraction that held the key. She thought of Margaret's guarded demeanor, Timothy's nervous fidgets, and Roland's cold detachment. Each had been close enough to act, but Clara's passion made her the most visible, the most likely to be suspected. "People's feelings can blind them, Inspector," she said softly, "but they can also blind others to the truth." As she left the station, Miss Marple's steps took her toward Clara's cottage, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of the case. The letter, she sensed, was a crucial piece, whether it was Cedric's words or another's deception. Clara's devotion, so raw and unguarded, could have made her a pawn in a larger game, or a perpetrator driven by a broken heart. Miss Marple recalled a village scandal where a young woman's love had led to reckless acts, and she resolved to tread carefully. The truth, as always, lay in the small things, the turn of a phrase, the flicker of an eye, the letter that promised too much. With her knitting bag at her side, she walked on, ready to unravel the next stitch in the mystery of Cedric Hawthorne's death. Chapter 6. The Assistant's Nerves. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green, where sparrows flitted among the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close against the cooling air, made her way back to St. Mary's bookshop, where the tragedy of Cedric Hawthorne's poisoning still lingered like an unwelcome guest. The bookshop's windows were shuttered, its door sealed with police tape, but Inspector Craddock had granted her access to examine the scene further, trusting her keen eye for details others overlooked. Her knitting bag, ever present, swung gently at her side, but her thoughts were fixed on Timothy Lyle, Cedric's nervous assistant, whose anxious demeanor at the signing had caught her attention. There was something about his agitation, she thought, that went beyond the shock of the moment. A fear, perhaps, rooted in something deeper. The bookshop, when she entered, was silent, its shelves looming like sentinels in the dim light. A constable stood guard at the door, nodding respectfully as Miss Marple stepped inside. The green baize table where Cedric had sat remained untouched, save for the absence of the water jug and shattered glass, now in the hands of the police laboratory. Miss Marple's eyes traced the room, noting the alcove by the back door, the crowded shelves, and the spot where Timothy had stood, fussing with pens and books. She recalled his jerky movements, the way his eyes had darted toward the exit, and the faint stain on his sleeve. Too dark for ink, too subtle to be blood. It reminded her of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had once hidden a pilfered bottle of chemicals behind a nervous laugh, his guilt betrayed by the smallest signs. Timothy, she had learned from village whispers, was staying at the Blue Boar, a modest guest house near the station. Miss Marple made her way there, her steps deliberate, her mind sifting through the fragments of the case. The guest house, a squat building with ivy-clad walls, was quiet, its parlor warmed by a crackling fire. Timothy was there, seated at a corner table, sorting through a pile of Cedric's papers, manuscript notes, schedules, and letters. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face paling, his hands freezing mid-task. "Miss Marple," he stammered, I didn't expect visitors." His voice was high, and his fingers twitched, betraying the same nerves she had seen at the signing. "I shan't disturb you long, Mr. Lyle," she said, settling into a chair opposite, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click. "I only wish to offer my sympathies. It must be dreadful, losing someone you worked so closely with." Timothy nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. "It's awful. Cedric was demanding, but I managed. I just did my job." His words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was sharp. "It's a heavy burden being an assistant," she said, "always at someone's beck and call with so little thanks. I knew a young man once, in our village, who worked for a difficult employer. He grew quite resentful, though he hid it well." Timothy's hands stilled, and he swallowed hard. "I wasn't resentful," he said, too quickly. Cedric paid me, gave me a chance when no one else would. I'm not educated like him, you see, just a clerk who got lucky." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her smile encouraging. "But it must have been tiring all the same, running errands, fetching water, managing crowds. I saw you at the signing, so busy. You poured that water for Mr. Hawthorne, didn't you?" Timothy's face flushed, and he nodded. "From a sealed bottle. I told the police that. I left it on the table when I went to get more books. I didn't see anything wrong." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle but probing. "And when you came back, did you notice anyone near the table, perhaps someone who shouldn't have been there?" Timothy's eyes darted to the papers, then back to her. "No, it was crowded. Miss Voss was shouting about the schedule, and that fan, Miss Henshaw, was right up front. I didn't see anything else." His voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way. His fingers twisted a pen, the stain on his sleeve catching the firelight. It was brownish, faint but persistent, and she thought again of that village lad whose nervous habits had betrayed a theft of something far more dangerous than money. "You seem troubled, Mr. Lyle," she said kindly. "More than one might expect, even after such a shock. Is there something weighing on you?" Timothy's shoulders hunched, and for a moment she thought he might speak, but he shook his head. "It's just the police, the questions. I don't know anything, I swear." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind was busy. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a nervous servant had hidden a master's indiscretions, his fear of exposure driving him to silence. Was Timothy protecting someone, or himself? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell on the papers he was sorting. Among them was a notebook, its pages filled with Cedric's sprawling handwriting, but one sheet, partially visible, bore a different script, neater, more precise. "Are those all Mr. Hawthorne's papers?" she asked casually. Timothy's hand moved to cover the notebook, his voice sharp. "Yes, just his notes. I'm organizing them for Miss Voss." Miss Marple smiled, thanking him, but as she stepped into the crisp afternoon, her thoughts lingered on that notebook. Its script reminded her of something. A letter, perhaps, or a document meant to deceive. She resolved to mention it to Inspector Craddock, along with the stain on Timothy's sleeve. At the police station, Craddock was reviewing witness statements, his desk cluttered with reports. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression a mix of amusement and respect. "Miss Marple, you're making my job harder by being so thorough. What's on your mind now?" She settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. "I've just come from Mr. Lyle, Inspector. He's a nervous young man, more so than seems natural. There's a stain on his sleeve. Not ink, I think, but something worth testing. And he's handling Mr. Hawthorne's papers, but one notebook had writing that wasn't his. It might be nothing, but—" Craddock's pen paused, his eyes narrowing. "You think he's hiding something? He's been cooperative, but jumpy. Said he poured the water from a sealed bottle, and the lab confirms the jug was clean. The cyanide was in the glass, slipped in during that minute he was gone." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "A minute is a long time, Inspector, when people are distracted. Mr. Lyle was near the table, but so were others. I wonder if he saw something he's afraid to tell, or if he did something he's afraid to admit." Craddock leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "We're checking his background. No record, but he's been with Hawthorne for years, always in the background. Miss Voss says he's loyal, but overworked. You think he might have had a grudge?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "People in the shadows, Inspector, sometimes see things others miss, or they keep secrets to protect themselves. I knew a boy in St. Mary Mead, a gardener's lad, who hid his master's thefts out of fear. Mr. Lyle's nerves suggest he carries a burden." As she left the station, the village was settling into evening, the lights in the cottages glowing softly against the dusk. Miss Marple's thoughts turned over Timothy's behavior, the stain, the notebook, the fear in his eyes. Was he a frightened witness, or had his loyalty to Cedric been strained to breaking? She recalled the water jug, left unattended, and the moment of chaos when all eyes were on Cedric's collapse. Timothy had been close enough to act, but so had others, and his nerves might point to guilt or to knowledge he dared not share. With her knitting bag at her side, Miss Marple walked home, her mind stitching together the threads of a puzzle that grew more intricate with each step. The truth, she knew, was often hidden in the smallest details, and she would find it, as she always did, by watching and waiting. Chapter 7. The Critic's Vendetta. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the damp earthiness of fallen leaves. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, made her way to the village hall, a sturdy brick building where the community gathered for lectures, plays, and the occasional heated parish meeting. Tonight, Roland Pierce, the literary critic whose scathing reviews had shadowed Cedric Hawthorne's career, was giving a talk on the decline of modern literature. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human motive, had decided to attend, her knitting bag tucked under her arm as a shield of innocuousness. Roland's cold detachment at the bookshop, his barbed words about Cedric's death, had lingered in her mind, stirring memories of a St. Mary Mead gentleman whose polished exterior had hidden a grudge that turned deadly. The hall was modestly filled, with villagers and a few literary enthusiasts from nearby towns seated on wooden chairs, their faces lit by the flickering glow of wall sconces. Roland stood at a podium, his lean frame clad in a dark suit, his sharp features accentuated by the light. His voice, clear and cutting, dissected contemporary novels with a relish that bordered on cruelty, his words laced with disdain for sensationalists like Cedric. Miss Marple, seated near the back, her needles clicking softly, observed the way his eyes scanned the room, not with nervousness, but with a kind of predatory alertness, as if daring his audience to challenge him. His lecture, she noted, was less about literature and more about asserting his own authority, a trait she had seen in a village scholar who once used his intellect to mask a personal vendetta. Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on joining her, whispered excitedly, "He's dreadful, Jane. Did you know he and Cedric were friends once? Years ago, before Roland turned on him. Something about a review that ruined their friendship." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving Roland. Mrs. Bantry's gossip, though often embellished, had a kernel of truth, and Miss Marple recalled a snippet from the village grapevine. Roland had once championed Cedric's early work, only to become his fiercest critic after a public falling out. The details were murky, but the bitterness in Roland's tone at the bookshop suggested a wound that ran deep. When the lecture ended, the audience clapped politely, though a few faces showed unease at Roland's biting remarks. Miss Marple lingered as the crowd dispersed, her small frame unassuming as she approached Roland, who was gathering his notes. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice gentle. "That was a most thought-provoking talk. I'm Miss Marple, from the village. I couldn't help but notice your strong views on Mr. Hawthorne's work at the bookshop." Roland's eyes narrowed, but he offered a thin smile. "Miss Marple, is it? Cedric's work was dangerous propaganda, stirring up trouble for no purpose but fame. I said as much in my reviews." Miss Marple's needles paused, her smile disarming. "It must be difficult, judging others' words so publicly. I knew a man in St. Mary Mead who wrote for the local paper. His critiques upset many, but he felt it was his duty. Did you feel that way about Mr. Hawthorne?" Roland's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Cedric's books were reckless. They slandered good people, exposed private matters. Someone had to call him out." His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened on his notebook, as if guarding a secret. "And yet," she said softly, "you were friends once, I hear. Such a pity when friendships turn sour." Roland's face stiffened, and for a moment she thought he might dismiss her. But he leaned closer, his voice low. "Cedric betrayed me, Miss Marple. He used my trust, my ideas, in his early work, then cast me aside when he got famous. His last book, The Bitter Truth, it mocked people I know, people who didn't deserve it. His next one would have been worse." Miss Marple's eyes met his, her expression serene, but her mind racing. She recalled a village feud where a betrayed friend had sabotaged a rival's garden, his anger simmering beneath a calm facade. Roland's vendetta, she sensed, was more than professional. It was personal. "Did you speak to him about it?" she asked, her tone mild. "At the signing, perhaps?" Roland's lips curled into a sneer. "I had no need to speak to him. My reviews said enough. I was there to observe, nothing more." Yet Miss Marple, watching closely, caught a flicker of unease in his eyes when she mentioned the signing. She pressed gently. "I noticed you near the bookshelf, close to the back door. It's a quiet spot, easy to go unnoticed." Roland's hand twitched and he stepped back, his voice cold. "I didn't go near his table, if that's what you're implying. I had no reason to." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unchanged, but her thoughts turned to the bookshop's layout, the alcove by the back door, where someone could slip in or out unseen. She thanked Roland and moved away, her mind piecing together his words. His hatred for Cedric was clear, but was it enough to drive him to murder? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a man's grudge had led to a poisoned bottle of wine, his calm demeanor hiding a meticulous plan. Roland's detachment, his proximity to the alcove, and his cryptic comment about Cedric's death being poetic justice weighed heavily in her thoughts. At the police station, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock poring over a report from the laboratory. He looked up, his expression weary but welcoming. "Miss Marple, you're a regular fixture now. What's on your mind?" She settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. "I've just come from Mr. Pierce's lecture, Inspector. He's a man with a sharp tongue and a sharper grudge against Mr. Hawthorne. Did you know they were once friends?" Craddock raised an eyebrow, jotting a note. "I didn't, but it fits. Pierce's reviews were vicious, called Cedric's work a blight on literature. You think it's personal?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I think, Inspector, that betrayal cuts deeper than professional rivalry. Mr. Pierce spoke of Cedric using his ideas, mocking people close to him. And at the signing, he was near the back door, a place where one might move unseen. I wonder if you've checked his movements before the event." Craddock nodded, his pen moving swiftly. "We're looking into everyone's whereabouts. Pierce claims he arrived just before the signing started, but a witness saw him near the bookshop's back entrance earlier, carrying a small case. Could be nothing. Critics carry notebooks, pens, but we'll follow it up." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the village lights glowed faintly against the dusk. "A small case," she murmured. "In St. Mary Mead, we once had a man who carried a case of tools that held something far more dangerous. Mr. Pierce's hatred seems to run deep, Inspector. I wonder what his reviews didn't say." Craddock's lips twitched, a sign he valued her insight. "We'll dig into his past with Hawthorne. In that case, if it's more than pens, we'll find out. Anything else?" She hesitated, her needles pausing. "Only that Mr. Pierce's calm is too perfect, Inspector. People who hate so fiercely often act when they think no one's watching. I'd be curious to know if he had access to cyanide, perhaps through a contact or a hobby." Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We're checking all their backgrounds for that. Cyanide's not easy to come by, but it's not impossible. The lab says it was a precise dose, slipped into the glass during that brief window." As Miss Marple left the station, the village was cloaked in evening shadows, the air sharp with the promise of frost. Her thoughts turned over Roland's vendetta, his words laced with a bitterness that felt personal, not merely literary. The small case, the back door, the scorn in his voice. They were pieces of a puzzle, fitting together with the precision of her knitting. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, widower, who had poisoned a rival's drink, his hatred masked by a cool exterior, until a single clue, a hidden vial, undid him. Roland's motives were clearer now, but the means remained elusive. With her knitting bag at her side, Miss Marple walked home, her mind stitching together the threads of a mystery that grew ever more tangled, yet ever closer to resolution. Chapter 8. The Letter and the Clue. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with a pale, watery light, the sky a patchwork of clouds that promised rain. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked along the narrow lane toward Clara Henshaw's cottage, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The village was stirring, its quiet rhythms punctuated by the clatter of a milk cart and the distant bark of a dog. But Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the puzzle of Cedric Hawthorne's death, the cyanide in his glass, the brief window of opportunity, the tangle of motives among the suspects. Each piece was falling into place, yet the pattern remained incomplete. Today, her focus was on Clara's letter, the supposed note from Cedric, promising a meeting that never occurred. Miss Marple, with her knack for spotting discrepancies, suspected it held a key to the mystery, whether as a genuine relic of devotion or a cunning deception. Clara's cottage, a small ivy-clad dwelling at the edge of the village, was modest but tidy, its garden a riot of late-blooming asters. Miss Marple knocked softly, and Clara opened the door, her face pale but composed, though her eyes still bore the shadow of grief. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice hesitant, "you've come for the letter, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle, but her gaze sharp. "If it's no trouble, dear, I thought it might help to understand Mr. Hawthorne's last days." Clara nodded, ushering her into a cramped sitting room, where a single armchair faced a small fire. On a table lay the bitter truth, its pages worn, and beside it a folded sheet of paper. Clara handed her the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. "This is it," she said. "He sent it a week before the signing. It meant everything to me." Miss Marple unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the typed text. It was brief, formal, promising a private meeting after the saint. Mary Mead event to discuss Clara's insights into his work. The signature, a bold Cedric Hawthorne, was striking, yet something about it caught Miss Marple's attention. She recalled her nephew Raymond's typewriter, how its letters had a distinct quirk, a slightly misaligned E that gave his manuscripts a unique stamp. This letter, though typed on clean paper, had no such quirks. The signature, too, was too neat, lacking the flourish she had seen in Cedric's autographs at the bookshop. "It's a lovely letter," she said, her voice mild. "Did you correspond with him often?" Clara shook her head, her eyes fixed on the paper. "Only a few letters, sent through his publisher. He answered this one, and I thought he saw me, really saw me." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. A forged letter, she thought, could serve many purposes, to stir Clara's hopes, to distract her at the signing, or to cast suspicion on her fervent devotion. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead incident where a forged note had lured a young man to a compromising meeting, the work of a rival with a hidden agenda. "You keep it safe, dear," she said, returning the letter. "The police may want to see it." Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple's steps were slow, her thoughts turning over the letter's implications. If it was a forgery, who had the means and motive to craft it? Margaret Voss, with access to Cedric's correspondence? Timothy Lyle, who handled his papers? Or Roland Pierce, whose vendetta might extend to manipulating others? She made her way to the police station, where Inspector Craddock was reviewing a stack of reports, his face etched with the strain of the case. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone a mix of warmth and exasperation. "You're here more than my constables? What's new?" She settled into a chair, her knitting needles emerging with their steady click. "I've seen Miss Henshaw's letter, Inspector. It claims to be from Mr. Hawthorne, promising a meeting, but I'm not convinced it's genuine. The signature looks too perfect, and the typing is too clean, not like a writer's usual work. I wonder if you could have it examined." Craddock's pen paused, his eyes narrowing. "A forgery? That's a new angle. Why would someone fake a letter to her?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. To stir her emotions, perhaps, or to make her a suspect. She was so visible at the signing, so emotional. A perfect distraction for someone slipping cyanide into that glass. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "We'll send it to the lab. The cyanide report's in. Definitely in the glass, not the jug. And it was a small, precise dose. Whoever did it acted fast. During that minute, Lyle was gone." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where rain now pattered against the panes. "I've been thinking about that minute, Inspector. The crowd was focused on Mr. Hawthorne, but someone moved unnoticed. I wonder about Mr. Pierce. He was near the back door, and a witness saw him there earlier with a case. Have you learned more about that?" Craddock leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "We're looking into it. The witness, a delivery boy, says Pierce was at the back entrance an hour before the signing, carrying a leather case, small, like for documents. He seemed in a hurry, didn't want to be seen. We're trying to track down the case, but Pierce claims it was just his notebook and pens." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to a village chemist who had once hidden poison in a shaving kit, his calm demeanor fooling all but the keenest observer. "A case can hold many things, Inspector," she said softly. "And Mr. Pierce's dislike of Mr. Hawthorne was more than literary, I think. He spoke of betrayal, of personal wrongs." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "You think it's him? His reviews were brutal, and he's got no alibi for that minute. But cyanide? Where would he get it?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "People with grudges find ways, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, we had a man who obtained poison through a friend in a laboratory, all to settle a score. Mr. Pierce is clever, educated. He might know such people." Craddock made another note, his expression grim. "We're checking all their contacts for cyanide sources. Voss has access to chemicals through her firm's printers. Lyle's background is clean, but he's jumpy. And Miss Henshaw, well, she's no chemist, but her devotion's intense." Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted neatly. "It's the small things, Inspector, that tell the story. The letter, the case, the glance that lingers too long. I'll let you know if I learn more." As she stepped into the rain, the village was hushed, the cottages glowing faintly through the drizzle. Her thoughts turned over the letter, its clean lines a contrast to Cedric's flamboyant style. If it was forged, it pointed to a mind that planned carefully, using Clara's devotion as a shield. Roland's vendetta, Timothy's nerves, Margaret's ambition, they were all threads, but the letter was a knot that needed untying. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead's scandal, where a forged will had turned friend against friend, the truth revealed by a single misplaced letter. With her knitting bag damp but secure, Miss Marple walked home, her mind stitching together the clues, each step bringing her closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 9. The motive unraveled. The rain had settled into a steady patter over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a gray veil that matched the somber mood lingering since Cedric Hawthorne's death. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella raised against the drizzle, walked with her usual measured gait toward St. Mary's bookshop, where Inspector Craddock had agreed to gather the 4 key figures, Margaret Voss, Clara Henshaw, Timothy Lyle, and Roland Pierce, for what he called a clarification of statements. Miss Marple, however, saw it as an opportunity to observe them together, to watch the interplay of their glances and silences, which so often revealed what words concealed. Her knitting bag, damp but secure, hung at her side, a quiet companion to her thoughts, which were busy weaving the threads of the case into a clearer pattern. The bookshop, still sealed to the public, was a hushed enclave, its shelves casting long shadows in the dim light of a single lamp. The green baize table, now bare of Cedric's books and glass, stood as a silent witness to the tragedy. Craddock had arranged chairs in a loose circle, and the suspects sat uneasily, their faces a study in contrasts. Margaret's stern composure, Clara's red-rimmed eyes, Timothy's nervous fidgeting, and Roland's cool detachment. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click, her presence so unassuming that the others scarcely noticed her. Yet her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The way Margaret avoided Roland's gaze, the way Timothy's hands twisted a handkerchief, the way Clara clutched her worn copy of The Bitter Truth as if it were a talisman. Craddock stood at the center, his notebook open, his voice calm but authoritative. "We've new information from the laboratory," he began, his eyes scanning the group. The cyanide was definitely in Mr. Hawthorne's glass, not the jug, and it was administered during the brief moment Mr. Lyle was away. One of you was close enough to act. I'd like to hear your accounts again, in light of this. Margaret spoke first, her tone clipped. I was managing the crowd, Inspector. I didn't touch the table or the glass. My focus was on keeping the event running smoothly. Her hands were folded tightly, but Miss Marple noted a slight tremor, a crack in her polished facade. Clara's voice was barely audible, her eyes fixed on her book. I was at the front, waiting for Cedric, Mr. Hawthorne, to sign my copy. I didn't see anything but him. Her grief was palpable, yet Miss Marple recalled the forged letter, its promise of a meeting that had fueled her devotion. Timothy, his face pale, stammered. I poured the water, like I said, from a sealed bottle. I stepped away for a minute. Less, maybe, to get more books. I didn't see anyone near the table. His eyes darted to the alcove by the back door, and Miss Marple wondered again about the stain on his sleeve, which Craddock had confirmed was being tested. Roland Pierce leaned back, his expression almost amused. I was by the bookshelf, taking notes. I had no reason to go near Cedric's table, and I didn't. His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the way. His fingers tightened on his pen, a subtle sign of tension. She recalled his lecture, his bitter words about Cedric's betrayal, and the witness who had seen him near the back door with a small case. Her mind turned to a saint. Mary Mead incident where a man's calm exterior had hidden a meticulous plan to poison a rival's drink, his motive rooted in a long, festering grudge. Miss Marple, her knitting steady, decided to stir the waters. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but carrying, "I wonder if you've heard about Mr. Hawthorne's unpublished manuscript. Mrs. Bantry mentioned it, a sequel to The Bitter Truth, even bolder, naming names that might have caused quite a stir." The effect was immediate. Margaret's head snapped up, her lips parting slightly. Clara's eyes widened, a mix of awe and sorrow. Timothy's hands stilled, his face paling further. Roland's sneer faltered, his fingers gripping his pen until his knuckles whitened. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her expression serene, but her mind was alert to their reactions. Craddock, quick to seize the moment, nodded. "Yes, we've heard of it. It's missing, though, possibly hidden in this very shop. If it names names, as Miss Marple suggests, it could point to a motive. Anyone know anything about it?" Margaret recovered first, her voice firm. "Cedric mentioned it, but it was unfinished. I never saw it." Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. "He told me it would change everything, but I didn't see it." Timothy mumbled. "I sorted his papers, but I didn't find anything like that." Roland's lips curled, but he said nothing, his silence louder than words. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The manuscript, real or rumored, was a catalyst, stirring fears and desires. She recalled a village scandal where a hidden diary had driven a man to desperate acts to keep its secrets buried. Roland's reaction, subtle but telling, suggested the manuscript threatened him most. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "Mr. Pierce, you were so critical of Mr. Hawthorne's work. Did you know about this sequel? It might have mentioned people close to you, perhaps." Roland's eyes met hers, cold and sharp. "I knew he was planning something even more reckless. It would have ruined lives, but I had no part in his schemes." Craddock pressed further, his tone deceptively mild. "Mr. Pierce, a witness places you near the back door before the signing, with a case. Care to explain?" Roland's composure held, but his voice tightened. I was checking the venue, as any critic might. My case held my notebook, nothing else. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to the cyanide's source. Roland's education, his connections in literary circles. Could he have accessed such a poison? She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, chemist, who had supplied a friend with a deadly compound, all for a favor. Roland's vendetta, she sensed, was the key, but the proof remained elusive. As the meeting ended, the suspects dispersed, their unease palpable. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the alcove by the back door. She approached Craddock, her voice low. "Inspector, that manuscript, whether it exists or not, is a powerful motive. Mr. Pierce's reaction was the strongest. He has a personal stake, I think, beyond his reviews." Craddock nodded, his notebook open. "We're searching for it, and we're checking Pierce's contacts. The lab's testing Lyle's sleeve stain. Could be chemical, but not cyanide. And that letter from Miss Henshaw. It's with the experts now. If it's a forgery, it changes things." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "People hide their motives, Inspector, but their reactions betray them. Mr. Pierce's hatred is deep, and that case he carried, it's worth a closer look." She recalled the back door, its curtained alcove, a perfect spot for a swift act. As she stepped into the rain, the village was quiet, its cottages huddled against the wet. Her thoughts turned to Roland's vendetta, Clara's letter, Timothy's nerves, and Margaret's ambition. The manuscript was the thread that tied them, but Roland's silence spoke loudest. With her knitting bag damp but secure, Miss Marple walked home, her mind stitching together the clues, each one a step toward the truth she knew lay just out of reach. Chapter 10. She the Trap. The drizzle had softened to a fine mist over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a delicate haze that blurred the edges of its cottages and hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tilted against the damp, walked with quiet purpose back to St. Mary's bookshop, where Inspector Craddock had agreed to a carefully orchestrated gathering. The plan, devised with Miss Marple's subtle guidance, was a ruse to shake loose the truth, a tactic she had seen work in St. Mary Mead when a village thief was caught by a baited trap. Her knitting bag, ever present, swung gently at her side, its contents a comforting constant, as her mind wove the threads of Cedric Hawthorne's murder into a tightening net. The cyanide in the glass, the forged letter to Clara, the missing manuscript, and Roland Pierce's bitter vendetta were all pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple sensed the moment had come to test their fit. The bookshop, its shutters still closed to the public, was a shadowed enclave, its air heavy with the scent of old books and the lingering weight of tragedy. Craddock had arranged the same circle of chairs, and the four suspects, Margaret Voss, Clara Henshaw, Timothy Lyle, and Roland Pierce, sat in uneasy silence, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions. Margaret's guarded composure, Clara's quiet grief, Timothy's nervous agitation, and Roland's studied calm. Miss Marple took her usual place at the back, her knitting needles clicking softly, her presence so unremarkable that the others barely glanced her way. Yet her eyes, sharp and watchful, noted every detail. The way Margaret's fingers tightened on her handbag, Clara's protective grip on her book, Timothy's restless shifting, and Roland's cool gaze, which flickered briefly toward the alcove by the back door. Craddock stood at the center, his demeanor calm, but his voice carrying a deliberate edge. "Thank you for coming," he began, his notebook tucked under his arm. "We've made progress in the investigation, and I've asked you here to clarify a few points. We've learned that Mr. Hawthorne's unpublished manuscript, a sequel to The Bitter Truth, may hold a clue to his killer. It's believed to be hidden somewhere in this bookshop, and we're conducting a search. I'd like your help to locate it." The announcement was calculated, a bait Miss Marple had suggested to stir the guilty into action. She had seen it before in St. Mary Mead, when a hidden ledger was discovered to flush out a blackmailer, his panic betraying his guilt. The suspect's reactions were immediate, though varied. Margaret's lips parted, her eyes narrowing as if calculating the implications. Clara's head lifted, her expression a mix of hope and sorrow, as if the manuscript might resurrect her idol. Timothy's hands stilled, his face paling, his eyes darting to the shelves as if fearing what they might conceal. Roland's sneer deepened, but his fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked to a corner of the shop near the alcove. She had planted a seed, and now she watched for the sprout. Craddock gestured to the shelves. "Feel free to look around. If you know anything about where Cedric might have hidden it, now's the time to say." The group dispersed, each moving with a purpose that betrayed their nerves. Margaret rifled through a stack of books near the front, her movements brisk but methodical. Clara lingered near the table, her fingers tracing the green baize as if seeking a trace of Cedric. Timothy, his hands shaking, poked at a shelf of old novels, his eyes avoiding the others. Roland, however, moved toward the alcove, his steps casual but deliberate, his hand brushing the curtain as he examined a low shelf. Miss Marple, her knitting steady, watched him closely, her mind recalling a village poacher who had once hidden stolen goods in a barn, his calm demeanor undone by a single, furtive glance. Craddock had placed a decoy, a small bottle labeled cyanide, but filled with harmless powder, on the shelf near the alcove, a trap suggested by Miss Marple to test the killer's nerve. She had seen such ploys work before, when a village gossip was caught stealing a planted letter, her greed, her downfall. Roland's hand hesitated near the bottle, his fingers hovering as if drawn by instinct. Then, with a swift movement, he slipped it into his pocket, his face expressionless, but his eyes darting to ensure he was unseen. Miss Marple's needles paused, her heart quickening, though her expression remained serene. She caught Craddock's eye, a subtle nod passing between them. Craddock moved swiftly, his voice sharp. "Mr. Pierce, what's that you've got?" Roland froze, his hand still in his pocket, his calm fracturing. "Just some papers," he said, but his voice was tight. Craddock stepped closer, his tone unyielding. "Empty your pockets, please." Roland's sneer returned, but he complied, producing the bottle with a forced laugh. "This? I thought it was a souvenir. Curious label, that's all." Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he took the bottle, holding it up to the light. "Curious indeed. Miss Marple, you were right to suggest we keep an eye on this shelf." The others turned, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. Margaret's hands clenched, Clara gasped, and Timothy's eyes widened, his nervous twitching stilled by the moment. Miss Marple rose, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Pierce, you were so quick to take that bottle. It reminds me of a man in St. Mary Mead who picked up a planted clue, thinking to hide his guilt. Why did you want it?" Roland's composure cracked, his voice rising. "This is absurd. I was curious, nothing more. You're fishing, old woman." Craddock stepped in, his authority commanding. "Mr. Pierce, we know you were at the back door before the signing with a case. We've traced a contact of yours, a chemist in London who supplied cyanide for research. And now you've taken a bottle labeled as poison. Care to explain?" Roland's face paled, his sneer gone, and for a moment silence hung heavy. Then, with a bitter laugh, he slumped in his chair. "You've got it all wrong," he began, but his voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes. Fear, not defiance. "It was the manuscript," Roland said at last, his voice low. "Cedric's sequel. It named my family, exposed a scandal from years ago. My father's ruin, my sister's disgrace. It was all there. I begged him to stop, but he laughed, said the truth was his art. I couldn't let it be published." Craddock's pen moved swiftly, his face grim. "So you poisoned him? Slipped cyanide into his glass during that minute Lyle was gone?" Roland's hands shook, his voice barely audible. "I had to. It was quick, clean. I got the cyanide from a friend, hid it in my case. No one saw me near the table." Miss Marple's needles were still, her gaze soft but unrelenting. "And the letter to Miss Henshaw?" she asked. "You forged it, didn't you, to make her a suspect, to distract from your own actions?" Roland's eyes met hers, and he nodded, defeated. "I knew she'd be emotional, draw attention. I typed it, copied his signature from a book. It was easy." Clara's sob broke the silence, her face crumpling, as she realized her devotion had been manipulated. Craddock signaled to a constable, who moved to Roland's side. "Roland Pierce, you're under arrest for the murder of Cedric Hawthorne." As Roland was led away, his defiance gone, the others stood in stunned silence. Margaret's face was unreadable, Clara's grief renewed, and Timothy's relief palpable. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, felt no triumph, only the quiet sorrow of a truth uncovered. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, widower, who had poisoned a rival to protect his family's name, his remorse coming too late. Roland's vendetta, fueled by betrayal and shame, had led him to the same dark end. As the bookshop emptied, Craddock approached Miss Marple, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You set the trap, didn't you? That bottle was your idea." She smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "People reveal themselves, Inspector, when they think they're safe. I only provided the opportunity." With her knitting bag at her side, she stepped into the mist, the village quiet around her. The truth of Cedric's death now laid bare. Chapter 11. The Confession. The rain had ceased in St. Mary Mead, leaving the village washed clean, its cobblestones glistening under a weak sun that broke through the clouds. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl adjusted against the lingering damp, sat in the small utilitarian waiting room of the village police station, her knitting bag resting on her lap. The air carried the faint scent of ink and polished wood, overlaid with the tension of a case nearing its close. Roland Pierce's arrest at St. Mary's bookshop the previous evening had sent ripples through the village, and now, as Inspector Craddock prepared to take Roland's formal statement, Miss Marple had been invited to listen, her quiet presence a testament to her role in unraveling the mystery. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her thoughts, which were still piecing together the final threads of Cedric Hawthorne's murder. The station's interview room was stark, its walls bare save for a single clock ticking relentlessly. Roland sat at a metal table, his lean frame slumped, the sardonic confidence of his critic's persona replaced by a weary resignation. Craddock, seated opposite, had his notebook open, his pen poised, while a constable stood by the door, his face impassive. Miss Marple, permitted to observe from a corner, was nearly invisible, her lavender cardigan blending into the shadows. Roland's eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, flickered toward her briefly, and she saw in them not defiance, but a kind of defeated recognition, as if he knew her gentle scrutiny had undone him. Craddock's voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Pierce, you've been charged with the murder of Cedric Hawthorne. You admitted last night to poisoning his water with cyanide. I need your full account, how you did it, why, and anything else relevant." Roland's hands, cuffed loosely, twitched on the table, and he let out a bitter sigh. "I'll tell you everything," he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual venom. "There's no point hiding it now." He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the table, as if it held the weight of his confession. "Cedric and I were friends once, years ago, when he was just starting out. I helped him, read his drafts, gave him ideas. He used them, got famous, then cut me out. That was bad enough, but the bitter truth, that book was personal. It dragged up my family's past, a scandal about my father's business dealings, my sister's mistakes. It wasn't fiction to me, it was a betrayal. And his sequel, he told me it would name names, dig deeper. I couldn't let it see print." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind recalling a St. Mary mead merchant who had sabotaged a rival's shop to protect his family's reputation, his desperation masked by a cool exterior until a single clue betrayed him. Roland's voice grew quieter. "I got the cyanide from a chemist friend in London, someone I knew from university. He thought I needed it for research, didn't ask questions. I carried it in a small vial, hidden in my notebook case. At the bookshop, I waited for my moment. When Timothy stepped away to get more books, the crowd was focused on Cedric. I slipped to the table, dropped the cyanide into his glass. It was quick, no one noticed." Craddock's pen moved swiftly, his face unreadable. "And the letter to Miss Henshaw? You admitted to forging it." Roland nodded, his lips twisting. "I knew Clara was obsessed with him. I'd seen her at other signings, always at the front, hanging on his every word. I typed the letter, copied his signature from a book I'd reviewed, sent it through his publisher's office. Easy enough to slip it in with other mail. I wanted her to be emotional, to draw attention, make her look like a suspect if it came to it." Clara's sob from the previous night echoed in Miss Marple's memory, and she felt a pang of sorrow for the girl whose devotion had been so cruelly exploited. "And the manuscript?" Craddock pressed. "Did you know where it was?" Roland shook his head. "I never saw it, but Cedric taunted me about it in London, said it was hidden where no one would find it. I figured it was in the bookshop, but I didn't have time to look. When you mentioned it yesterday, I panicked, thought you'd find it and see my family's name." His voice broke, and he looked down, his hands clenching. "I didn't want to kill him, not at first. I just wanted him to stop." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind remained sharp. She recalled a village widower who had poisoned a neighbor to silence a secret, his remorse genuine, but too late to undo the act. Roland's confession was complete, yet she sensed a lingering question. Why had he taken the bait of the decoy bottle so readily? It suggested a fear of exposure beyond the manuscript, perhaps a deeper shame tied to his family's past. She made a mental note to ask Craddock about Roland's background, though she suspected the answer lay in the pain she saw in his eyes. Craddock closed his notebook, his voice steady. "That's enough for now, Mr. Pierce. You'll be held pending further investigation." As the constable led Roland away, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked back into her bag. Craddock turned to her, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You knew he'd take the bottle, didn't you? That trap was your doing." She smiled faintly, her voice gentle. "People act on their fears, Inspector. Mr. Pierce was afraid of that manuscript, afraid of what it would reveal. The bottle was a test, and he failed it." Outside, the village was quiet, the sun casting a tentative glow over the wet rooftops. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, her thoughts heavy. Margaret, Clara, and Timothy were cleared, their motives, ambition, devotion, fear, falling short of murder. Margaret's guarded demeanor had been protective, not guilty. Clara's grief was real, her heart broken by a forged promise. Timothy's nerves stemmed from overwork and the shock of witnessing death. Roland alone had acted, his vendetta a poison as deadly as the cyanide he used. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead spinster who had once hidden a family scandal, her silence a burden that shaped her life. Roland's actions, she thought, were born of a similar need to shield what was left of his family's name. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The case was solved, yet she felt no triumph, only the quiet sadness of a life lost and another ruined. She thought of Cedric, whose words had stirred such passion and peril, and of Roland, whose hatred had consumed him. The truth had been found, as it always was, in the small things: a forged letter, a hidden vial, a moment of panic. With her needles clicking softly, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the village, knowing that peace would return, but that another mystery, another tangle of human motives, would surely find her in time. Chapter 12. The village settles. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle clarity, its rays piercing the last wisps of morning mist and bathing the village in a soft, golden light. The cottages along the high street stood serene, their thatched roofs gleaming with dew, as if the turmoil of Cedric Hawthorne's murder had been washed away by the recent rain. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her small sitting room, gazed out her window at the familiar scene, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm in her lap. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the chintz armchairs and the polished table where a pot of tea steamed gently. Her mind, however, was still threading through the events of the past days, the puzzle of the fatal book signing now resolved, but leaving behind the quiet ache of human frailty exposed. St. Mary's bookshop had reopened that morning, its shutters thrown wide to let in the light, though whispers of the tragedy lingered among the villagers who passed its door. Mrs. Bantry, ever the purveyor of local news, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, her face alight with the mixture of excitement and indignation that only a solved mystery could provoke. "Jane, you've done it again," she exclaimed, settling into a chair with a rustle of her floral dress. Roland Pierce, of all people, to think he'd go so far as to poison poor Cedric over a family scandal. It's like something out of a novel, his own novel no less. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles clicking softly. "It's a sad business, Dolly. Mr. Hawthorne's words stirred deep passions, and not all of them were kind. I've seen it before, in our own village. A man driven to desperate acts to protect what he held dear." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead farmer, who had once sabotaged a neighbor's crops to shield his family's pride, his regret coming too late to mend the harm. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes bright. "But how did you know it was Roland? That bottle trick, pure genius. You must tell me everything." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the garden where late roses nodded in the breeze. "It was the small things, Dolly, as it always is. Mr. Pierce's hatred was too sharp, too personal, to be just a critic's disdain. His reaction to the manuscript, the way he moved to the alcove at the bookshop, it told a story. And the letter to poor Miss Henshaw, forged to make her a distraction. People reveal themselves when they think no one's watching." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, delighted. "It's like my gardener spotting weeds, Jane. You see what's hidden in plain sight. But what about the others? Miss Voss, that nervous boy Timothy, and Clara with her broken heart." Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts turning to the other suspects, now cleared of guilt, but not of their burdens. Margaret Voss had returned to her publishing house, her ambition intact, but tempered by the loss of her star author. Clara Henshaw, her devotion shattered by Roland's deception, had retreated to her cottage, her copy of The Bitter Truth now a bittersweet relic. Timothy Lyle, freed from suspicion, had taken a job at a local library, his nervous energy finding a quieter outlet. Each had been touched by the tragedy, their motives, ambition, love, fear, laid bare but falling short of murder. Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress who had once clung to a false promise, her heart mending only with time, and she hoped Clara would find peace. "The truth is a heavy thing, Dolly," she said softly. "Mr. Hawthorne's book stirred secrets that people wanted buried, and Mr. Pierce paid the highest price for his fear of them." She thought of Cedric, whose bold words had sparked both admiration and enmity, and of Roland, whose vendetta had consumed him. The manuscript, still missing, was a ghost that haunted her thoughts, perhaps hidden in the bookshop, perhaps destroyed, but its shadow had driven a man to kill. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead diary that had never been found, its secrets safe, but its legacy, one of sorrow. Mrs. Bantry sighed, reaching for a scone. "You're a marvel, Jane. The village is settling now, but it won't forget this in a hurry. Will you go to the bookshop's reopening? They're holding a little memorial for Cedric." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile faint. "I think I'll stay here, Dolly. The village has had enough excitement, and my roses need tending." Mrs. Bantry laughed, rising to leave, her chatter trailing out the door like a cheerful breeze. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple stepped into her garden, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. The roses, though past their prime, bloomed with a quiet resilience, their petals falling gently to the earth. She thought of Cedric, whose truth had cost him his life, and of Roland, whose fear had led to ruin. The village would heal, as it always did, its rhythms restoring order to the chaos of human passions. Yet Miss Marple knew that another mystery, another tangle of motives, would find her soon enough, as they always did in St. Mary Mead. With her knitting bag left by the door, she knelt to tend her roses, her mind at rest but ever watchful, ready for the next thread to unravel.